Alright, so this is Ecology video part 2. We're going to be talking about how organisms interact with their environment. Okay. First thing we need to do is define a new vocabulary term. The word is niche, not niche, niche. And basically it describes how an organism functions within a community of living organisms. So this is going to include what space it takes up, what resources it uses like food, shelter, how it interacts with others through competition, things like that. No two organisms from different species can occupy the same niche. They can be similar, but not the same. And so we find that is called competitive exclusion. If you could please go to my website and you'll see a link there for you to read a little bit more about competitive exclusion, and there are a couple examples there for you to help you understand it. To deal with competitive exclusion, we find that some organisms that have very similar niches engage in what is known as resource partitioning. Okay, so in resource partitioning, what we're going to have here is we're going to see that these organisms are all sharing the same area. They are all hunting for insects within the same tree. But the way they're going to split it up, sometimes they can split it up by the type of species that they hunt. Sometimes they split it up by where within the shared area they hunt, okay? Things like that, the time of day that they're hunting, different ways to use the same resource but separately. I know it's a bit of a difficult concept, but I think you'll get the hang of it soon. Okay, so now let's talk about ways we can relate. So for each of these, you're going to see a plus, a 0, or a minus. Okay, plus means it has a positive effect, minus means it has a negative effect, and a 0 means it has no effect. So here what we're going to see, predation, obviously one organism benefits by capturing and eating the other, which obviously does not benefit. So you see a couple of pictures here. Take a look at the graph and you'll see that the blue represents the hare, which is the prey, and the red represents the lynx, which is the predator. And so we see population sizes are almost aligned with each other, okay? We say that their relationships are cyclical. So, for example, as the hare population would increase, there's more prey around, which means there's more food available for predators. So then the predator population will increase as well. Okay? Sometimes organisms can benefit from one another, not in a predation form, but through a shared living situation. Okay? For example, mutualism. Okay, that is where both species are going to benefit from the interaction, so that's plus plus. Best example, pollination, right? Bees are able to get nectar and other nutrients from flowers, so they get a plus there. Whereas the flower benefits by spreading pollen, which is plant sperm. And as the bee moves from flower to flower, it distributes that sperm. There are lots of different examples of mutualism. Okay. Another symbiotic relationship would be commensalism. Okay, here one organism benefits, but the other one is a 0, meaning it has no effect on them. For example, barnacles, they're going to hitch a ride on a whale. Barnacles are what we call sessile, meaning that they really do not move a lot, but in order to catch food, they need to filter water. Well, wouldn't it be great if you could hitch a ride on the fin of a whale, and as it propels itself through the water while swimming, you are then filtering a whole bunch of food and it's able to allow you to move. The barnacles being on the fins have no effect on the whale whatsoever. Okay? Amensalism would be just the opposite. And this one's sort of hard to understand, I think. So in this relationship, one organism is negatively affected while the other organism has no effect. So this happens sometimes. A plant, for example, a black walnut tree, will excrete chemicals into the soil to prevent other competitors around it from growing. Unfortunately, it also tends to kill any plant life in the area, whether they were competing with them or not. So that would be an example of amensalism. Okay, parasitism. Not the same as predation, but also a plus-minus like predation. Okay, the benefit that the organism gets is that that organism lives off of a host species, which is negatively affected. For example, tapeworms. I'm sure you've seen all those gross TV shows like Monsters Living Inside Me and things like that. Yes, tapeworms do affect humans. They can affect pigs and many other mammals as well. And what they do is they live inside of you. They reproduce. They eat your food instead of allowing you to consume the nutrients from your food. And so that has a negative effect on you. Also, things like ticks and mosquitoes, they don't necessarily live within their host, but they're going to feed off of their host. You could say a leech would fall under this as well. Okay, so those are all the relationships. So now we're going to look at, eat or be eaten. How does energy flow through a community? Well, ultimately, we have to start by producing energy, and we talked a little bit about this in Chapter 8. We already have heard about autotrophs. Photosynthesis, we know, are when our producers are going to use sunlight to produce the high energy carbohydrates. But there's also chemosynthesis, and this is a very strange case that we have found, where there are some organisms, namely bacteria, which are going to be able to use the energy stored in chemicals, okay? Hydrogen sulfide, for example, a sulfur compound, and they're going to use that in order to produce their sugars. These are not very common at all, and actually what we find is that it is only this group of organisms at the deep sea vents, they're called hydrothermal vents, where they secrete these, sulfur-containing compounds, that we find these organisms growing. So ultimately, what do we know? The sun is going to be our main source of energy for all of Earth. And we know that if we did not have the sun, we would not be able to survive. Okay. So the producers do not make up all of our living things. Instead, we have consumers, and they are going to get their energy by eating. And we've talked about the word heterotrophs before. Okay, how does this happen? Well, by consuming another organism, they are taking in those carbohydrates, and then they're going to convert that glucose, C6H12O6, into ATP, and that is that temporary energy storage molecule for the cell. Nice little Chapter 9 review for you. If you're a little rusty on it, feel free to go back and take a look. Okay. All right, different types of consumers. Here's a little research assignment for you. Okay, these are the names of the 5 main types of consumers, and they're broken up based on what they eat. What I'd like you to do is go on the internet and find 2 examples of each type, and I want you to put that in your notes next to your description here. Alright, so as energy moves from one organism to another, it produces a hierarchy. So producers would be at the bottom of that, and then the energy that is being consumed is going to move up through each level or step in the chain, and we call these trophic levels. So as we said, producers are at the bottom, then those organisms that eat producers would be primary consumers, or what we would call 1C. Okay, so in this example here, let's look at the terrestrial side. Okay, we have grass, and that grass is going to be eaten by a grasshopper. Okay, well then the grasshopper is then eaten by a rodent. So that rodent's a secondary consumer, and then that rodent can be eaten by a hawk, which makes a tertiary consumer. You can have, many more levels of consumers above that, but we'll only talk up to the level 4, which is called a quaternary consumer. Okay, and then off to the side there, on all sides, we see the detritivores and the decomposers, because anytime an organism passes away, their body material will be of use to those 2 groups of consumers there. Remember, very important, energy is neither created nor destroyed, it is merely transferred. So when one organism dies, that doesn't mean the energy just sort of stops there. What's going to happen is the body will be broken down, that energy will be released in compounds back into the soil, which will be taken up by, a detritivore or a decomposer, and then will wind up back in the grass. So all of our energy is cyclical. So we can study this by looking at some very strongly linked organisms based on a food chain. And note that energy flows only in one direction here. It goes from who is being eaten to who is doing the eating. So ultimately, we want to see the energy end up at our top level consumer there. So here is a nice food chain. You see we have algae, which are green, meaning they're photosynthetic, and they're eaten by zooplankton, which are animals. They are eaten by small fish, which are eaten by squid, which are eaten by a shark. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video here, and I want you to label producer and level of consumer for each of these organisms. When you're ready, hit the play button and you will see the answer key. Okay, so here we have the answer key. We only have one producer in this food chain, and then the rest are all going to be consumers, and the numbers are going to reflect what level consumer they are. So in this case, our shark is our top consumer. When you eat an organism, unfortunately, you do not get 100% of their energy. You actually only get 10% of their energy. The rest of it is lost as heat. It might be wasted, or it might be in unedible parts of the body, or parts of the body that do not turn into energy. Okay, for example, cartilage and things like that. You can't break that down and turn that into sugar. So take a look at both of these food chains for a little bit closer example there. And this explains why we see fewer organisms at the top of the food chain. As you move up the food chain, it's 10% less, 10% less, 10% less, 10% less. And so these large consumers at the top of the food chain have to eat a large number of organisms in order to continue surviving. Then we can take food chains and we can link them together, and we can see how they interact to form a food web. So one thing to note here, it's very important that in one food chain, for example, let's see, who do I have here? Okay, well, let's look at the bird that's here, right? Okay, in one food chain here, this bird looks like let's see, a third level consumer, okay? But in another level, and then, that would be it. But in another level, it looks like it's going to be a second level consumer. So, we go plant to caterpillar, right to bird. So in each food chain, it's going to have a different trophic level. Within food webs, you have to take that into account. Okay? And then we're going to start our next video with succession and nutrient cycles.